Thank you for joining us today for Hallowed Ground, Preserving Black Churches, the final webinar in our 2023 webinar series, Preserve the Past, Build for the Future. We're recording this session and it will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. I'm Susan Glimsher, the Director of Communications, Education, and Outreach with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The ACHP is an independent federal agency that promotes the economic, educational, environmental, and cultural values of historic preservation. We also advise the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. The ACHP also influences federal activities, programs, and policies that affect historic and cultural properties. We are comprised of 24 statutory members, and we are the only federal agency whose sole mission is historic preservation. A large part of our work is overseeing the Section 106 review process, which comes from the National Historic Preservation Act. This requires federal agencies and those receiving federal funding or federal licensure to consider historic preservation when carrying out any undertaking. This webinar series fulfills several aspects of our mission: to educate the public about historic preservation, to bring young people into the field, and to build a more inclusive preservation program. We have a great lineup. We have had a great lineup this year for this series. The recordings of the first 4 webinars are available to view, and I'm going to ask Lynn to put them in the chat now. We are really excited about our guests today, and I am also very excited about the subject that we are covering. So let me introduce them and ask them to just come on for a minute. That would be Lawana Holland-Moore, the Director of Fellowships and Interpretive Strategies, African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Joining her is Leslie Canaan, the Senior Manager of Preserving Black Churches, also with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Next, we have Nicole Drummond, the Director of Religious Education, Youth Ministry, Basilica of St. Mary of the Immaculate Conception in Norfolk, Virginia. And finally, Mary Harris, the President and Chair of Wilson County Black History Committee, Pickett Chapel. Hi, Mary. Pickett
Good afternoon.
Wilson County, Tennessee. If you have any questions or any comments during the conversation, please put them in the chat box. Once the speakers have given their presentations, my colleague Lynn Richmond will pose all of your questions to the speakers. Now, let's begin this great webinar. If I can call on Lawana, followed by Leslie. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. I'll go ahead and get my presentation up. Hello, everyone. I'm Lawana Holland, Director of Fellowships and Interpretive Strategies of the National Trust for Historic Preservation's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. Along with my colleague, Leslie Canaan, Senior Manager of Preserving Black Churches, it is our pleasure to talk to you about the Action Fund and its national grant program opportunities. The African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund is the National Trust for Historic Preservation's multi-year, multi-million-dollar initiative committed to crafting a narrative that expands our view of history by telling the full story of African American historic sites and promote a national identity that reflects the nation's true diversity. The Action Fund is the largest preservation effort ever undertaken in support of African American historic sites. African American history is American history. And by elevating these stories and places, we look to not only understand our past, but to also create opportunities for dialogue and to form stronger arguments for how to link preservation to the honoring of our ancestors and the honoring of ourselves. We keep places alive through collaboration with and the dedication and perseverance of grassroots advocates, preservationists, scholars, politicians, and the community itself to uncover and make visible these stories that contribute to our collective historical narrative as a nation. Picture the Shockoe Bottom in Richmond, Virginia, once one of the largest slave trading markets in the United States, second only to New Orleans. Through intervention, our support, this sacred space is not in danger anymore of becoming a stadium or anything else, but a place to remember and reflect as a memorial park and site. To be able to talk about the work of the Action Fund and its purpose is to ask a question that's often asked of us. Why is the preservation of African American historic sites and places important? When we speak of place, we speak of memory, of tangible connections. We can walk where they walk, touch what they touch, be where they were. Place allows us to inhabit a moment in time, connecting us to those through lines that link us to the past. But when those stories have not been heard, obscured, or been omitted outright, there's a gap, a hole that becomes our responsibility to discover and peel back those layers within a site to give us a more complete picture of place. Part of reclaiming history is the empowerment that comes with being able to actively support sites, organizations, and outward-facing projects that are working to make it happen. This means supporting projects and programming at our National Trust historic sites, such as the Woodrow Wilson House pictured here, our preservation leadership trainings for organizations to learn best practices and strengthen their boards and work, our fellows who are creatives, practitioners, and scholars thinking about how to talk about preservation in new and innovative ways. Funding the 2019 Preserving African American Places Equity Report that examined gentrification, displacement, historically Black neighborhoods nationwide, and working with Hope Crew, the National Trust hands-on preservation experience program that helps to encourage and inspire a new generation to train in the preservation trades. We also provide technical assistance for any site or the public to find out more about what they can do to preserve their historic site. We often do interventions to help save and protect African American historic sites and structures, such as the Brockway Center in Oklahoma City, pictured here. It's not enough to say that you want to make a difference. You have to actively do it. The Action Fund is now in cycle 6 of our national grant program. We have hit and surpassed our original goal of $25 million, and thanks to a $20 million gift from philanthropist Mackenzie Scott and another $20 million in funding from the Lilly Endowment for our Preserving Black Churches project, we are now a more than $80 million fund. The Action Fund recently celebrated our 5th anniversary, and we hope to continue to draw attention to the remarkable and still largely unrecognized and unheard collection of places and stories of African American activism and achievement. Since January 2018, we have vetted over 3,000 project proposals requesting over $311 million and have awarded over $12.4 million to over 160 awardees and projects nationwide. Through our national grant program and involvement in initiatives such as our Historically Black Colleges and Universities Cultural Stewardship Initiative in partnership with the National Endowment for the Humanities, we've been able to see and bring awareness to the breadth of African American preservation need. Along with our Conserving Black Modernism initiative, it gives us a sense on a national scale of not only the need, but who is doing what are the interests, what are the concerns. I would now like to turn this over to my colleague, Leslie Canaan, Senior Manager of Preserving Black Churches, who will now tell you more about our Preserving Black Churches initiative. But if you'd like to know more about the Action Fund and our work, please visit savingplaces.org. Leslie?
Thank you, Lawana, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Leslie Canaan, the Senior Manager of Preserving Black Churches. a grant program of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And with the support of the Lilly Endowment Incorporated, last year we were able to provide funding for 35 churches across the country for over $4 million. And we have made those grant awards on Martin Luther King Jr. Day this past January. Next slide. In his book, The Black Church, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. says, no pillar of the African American community has been more central to its history, identity, and social justice vision than the Black church. They are the oldest institutions created and controlled by African Americans, and the historic buildings that house these congregations are a living testament to the achievements and resiliency of generations in the face of racialized and inequitable society. I would say that not only are churches places to worship, they can be places to learn history, to physically connect with our past and connect what we face today. Churches are still what they have always been, anchors that inform and shape Black identity today and are foundational to Black religious, political, economic, and social life. They serve as houses of worship, safe havens, social centers, and cultural repositories. They provide all manner of vital services and space for community programs that uplift the broader social, economic, and cultural health of their communities. They are places of joy and places where Black people are allowed to take up space. And in some changing communities, they are the last reminders of Black communities that are no longer there. Next slide. So what is preserving Black churches? What it is several things. It is a new grant fund to directly support funding historic Black churches for capital, staffing, programming and interpretation, and operations. And over the next several years, over the next 2 to 3 years, we intend to give out grants to both non-active and active congregations. We also have created a new rapid response and emergency grant fund to address imminent threats to Black churches. And we've already started to do some of that work. And we also have 2 new special resources focused on Black churches serving as sites of social justice and sites of civil rights. One will be focused on sites of social justice, which we have not announced yet. And others will be specifically focused on sites of civil rights in Alabama. And we are working with folks in Alabama to identify churches that will get wraparound services, stewardship services in Alabama. And we are working on those this year as well. Next slide. And so what does it mean to be eligible to be a historic Black church? Well, one is it could be that your church was built by African Americans. Your architect was African American. Your congregation has been in a church that was originally not built for African Americans, but they've been there for at least 50 years. You are a non-active congregation, African American congregation, that wants to repurpose a church for another use, for a community center. So there's all sorts of ways to identify as a Black church, either as an active congregation or a non-active congregation. Next slide. So in general, when we look at our program, what we're looking for is either active congregations, so historically Black churches. You can be a nonprofit or you can be a public agency. We award funds from $50,000 to $200,000. Our different categories are capital projects, endowments and financial sustainability, organizational capacity and operations, programming and interpretation, and project planning. I will tell you that coming next month, we will have a webinar in which we're going to go over our application, and we're going to go over each question, and we're going to tell you what we're looking for. And then our actual applications are going to open in July for our next round of grant applications. And we think that this is so important because we think across the country, we see that Black churches, which are so important to the Black community, are struggling for all sorts of reasons. And saving those buildings is not just about the buildings, but also helping those congregations and helping those communities that depend on those Black churches for all sorts of reasons. Next slide. So I want to introduce you to just a few of the churches that we did award in this last round. And so the first church I'm going to introduce you to is Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church in Ohio, which is actually associated with the anti-slavery movement. The next church I'm going to introduce you to is Corey United Methodist in Cleveland, Ohio, which is associated with the civil rights history. Then we have Reedy Chapel AME Church in Galveston, Texas. It's one of the first places where the General Order Number 3 was read and is now celebrated as Juneteenth. Then we have Old Ship in Montgomery, Alabama, which is associated with civil rights history. Then last but not least is First African Baptist in Beaufort, South Carolina, and it's associated with Robert Smalls and Blacks during Reconstruction. And this is just 5 of the 35 churches that we awarded last January with our new grants program. And I look forward to any questions that you might have about our Preserving Black Churches program. Thank you. And if you have any questions after this webinar, feel free to go to savingplaces.org, Black churches, or email us. Our email address is really simple. It is blackchurches@savingplaces.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ladies. I have to say, Leslie, I think this is the first time I've actually met you, and you're fabulous. So, so welcome to this program. I could be wrong, but you're marvelous. And we actually did just get a chat from a gentleman who it seems like maybe a descendant of someone who attended one of those churches. And I explained that we'll be sharing everyone's contact information at the end of the webinar. So thank you. So now I would like to welcome Nicole Drummond to the conversation. Nicole.
Okay, so I, as you were recently heard, am from the Basilica of St. Mary of the Immaculate Conception. It is in Norfolk, Virginia. In the beginning, our Catholic community was established in 1791. The Basilica is the oldest Catholic community in the Diocese of Richmond and is often called the Mother Church of Tidewater. The parish is located in downtown Norfolk. And when it was originally built, it was called St. Patrick Church. It predates our diocese by 29 years. And our early parishioners at St. Patrick were French Catholics fleeing persecution in the French Revolution. The original church was built in 1842, and it was destroyed in a fire in 1856. It is suspected by arson by the Know-Nothings. This crucifix right here is the only thing that survived that fire that consumed St. Patrick's Church in 1856. It is still in our church to date. And if you can see right here, there's a little scorch mark and there's a mark right here. That is the only evidence of burn that it has on it. It was found in the rubble of the church, and it looks like it was completely untouched except for those scorch marks right here. The current church that we now have was built in 1858, and the parish changed its Our name was then changed to St. Mary of the Immaculate Conception, making it the first church, so named after the dogma of the Immaculate Conception by Pope Pius IX. So in 1889, the Diocese of Richmond dispatched the St. Josephite Fathers to Norfolk to establish St. Joseph, a mission church of St. Mary's. The first students were chiefly Protestant students who would convert. The original school housed students from the 1st to 12th grade. It provided the only Catholic high school in the city of Norfolk. And it was home to the first high school band in the city. It was also the only Catholic church for African Americans at that time, and it was specifically created as a worship space and a school for African Americans. In 1961, because of the city's renewal program, they decided to close St. Joseph, and the parishioners would then have to be merged with that of St. Mary's, a predominantly European church at the time. So when the parishioners from St. Joseph came over to St. Mary's, they experienced white flight, which means all of the European parishioners left, and it became 99% African-American membership. In 1979, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and in 1983, the church initiated an extensive renovation and restoration program, and they completed that program in 1989. So this is what the original church looked like. It had a middle aisle, the altar was low, and afterwards, this is what they restored it to be. In September of 1991, the Church of St. Mary of the Immaculate Conception became a minor basilica. It is one of the 34 minor basilicas in the United States. It is first of 2 in Virginia and the only predominantly African-American one in the country. The parish supported a school that was named St. Mary's Academy. I actually attended the school when I was in elementary from kindergarten to 5th grade. And it was an inner city school that provided a Christian education to hundreds of urban children, most of whom were non-Catholic who later converted. In early 2010s, we noticed there was a leak. The issue is the skeleton. The structure that holds up the roof is all rotten. So beams, all of the rafters, all of the joints are all in some level of decay and rooting. That is what we found out. At first, we thought it was just a leak and we just had to patch it up. The first budget for that was $20,000, and that quickly grew to a $6.9 million capital improvement. While doing that capital improvement, we realized that this church was built on top of not only an ancestral cemetery, but also a waterway that we believe could be used for another purpose.
Newly discovered graves in a secret tunnel lie in the heart of Norfolk, and a historian believes they may be connected to the Underground Railroad. 13 News Now reporter Megan Puryear went to the site of the discovery.
It's not your average church. Beneath the ground, construction workers have discovered a tunnel that may have been part of the Underground Railroad.
Oh, this space is sacred. It is an absolutely sacred space.
Father Jim Curran says for centuries, the Basilica of St. Mary of the Immaculate Conception in Norfolk stood differently than most churches.
It was always unique in that there was always an interracial element.
Still, the choir loft is where African Americans had to sit. Their faith is still imprinted in the wood with knee indentations.
They were started by those free blacks and those slaves who were worshiping here.
Today, everyone sits on the first floor.
I would be sitting about here.
But having that tiny spot is Aretha Pretlow's greatest relief.
Every time I walk across those doors, I always immediately left behind those troubles because I felt a safe haven here.
Ironically, a tunnel for safety may have always run beneath her feet.
My ancestors came here because they felt a sense of a safe haven.
Construction crews recently uncovered a tunnel and 3 crypts.
The trajectory of the pipe goes into the heart of the Black community.
Historian Cassandra Newby Alexander believes the tunnel served as a passageway for freedom fighters along the Underground Railroad.
And that could be a space where you could hide until the ship was ready to receive you.
The professor says someone protected the tunnel.
Those who built it in 1858 were conscious of what was here and wanted to protect it.
And took the secret to the grave. In Norfolk, Megan Purrier, 13 News Now.
As of right now, this is what our newly restored church looks like. Because we are a historic landmark, when we restored it, we had to go back to the original structure. And so as closely as possible. So we put back in our middle aisle. There are still aisles on each side. We could not change the edifice at all, but we did as much as we could to incorporate our African-American heritage in this church. This is another picture from the altar view. Our original 16-pipe organ still sits and is, and we still use it today doing mass. And this is just another view of the altar of our church. This was painted blue and all of the gold trimmings. This is just a view from the balcony of the church during one of its services. And here is our view from the outside. The church still stands in the same building and condition that it was in when it was built in 1858. We did apply and was awarded one of the grants that Leslie spoke of earlier. I believe we were awarded the organizational capacity and operations grant to hire staff that would be able and are capable of keeping our structure up to date, making sure that we're keeping up with the maintenance of the building and ensuring that it is preserved throughout the next generations. Not only do I work here, but this is my home church. This is where I was raised. This is where I was baptized, and this is where I continue to raise my children in their faith. And that is the end of my presentation.
Well, Nicole, I have to just echo the comments of like the last 11 people. That is absolutely fascinating. I would love to come visit. Is the tunnel something that can be seen?
Not at this time. So because we are a historic landmark and we receive some tax credits back to help pay for the 6.9 million capital improvement, we had to cover it up, but we are actually, now that we have waited a lot of time to make improvements, we are actually in the beginning, the pre-phase 1 plans of exploring another option. Well, not exploring, but showing how we could expose the tunnel as well, because it leads out and to the outside, which is going towards the water. And there's actually a shed door that we can open for tour. And it's high enough where people at least probably a little below 6 feet can walk straight, standing up.
I mean, what a story. All you need now is to find a journal and you can publish about 3 books on this. That is quite amazing. Thank you so much, Nicole.
You're welcome.
All right, and so now I would like to turn to our final speaker, Mary Harris. Mary, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Mary McAdoo Harris, and I serve as the president of the Wilson County Black History Committee. Pickett Chapel, the soul of Wilson County history. National, state, and local recognition. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places for architectural and religious significance. Recipient of grants from National Park Service and Tennessee Historic Commission. Included in Historic Lebanon's district. Pickett Chapel is a rare historical site. For 189 years, it served white and Black congregations as a house of worship and the community at large as home for theater, productions, and other events. Unique opportunity to present and preserve the history of Lebanon and Wilson County through the eyes of its citizens and our founders then and to the present. It's a complete historical resource containing preserved architecture, archaeology, archival records, and oral histories. It survived threat of fire, the Battle of Lebanon, and 20th century growth and change. Pickett Chapel sits on an original town lot. Pickett Chapel is the only remaining building from first wave of construction in Lebanon. It's on the northeasternmost lot of original town layout and is the only undisturbed piece of property remaining from the 1820s. First generation of churches. Pickett Chapel was one of the first, perhaps the first formal house of worship in Lebanon, Tennessee. Founded in 1827 by white Methodists, and it was built of handmade bricks by enslaved African Americans, some who worshiped there in bondage until the Civil War. In 1866, Pickett Chapel became one of the first generations of Black churches established after the Civil War and held services there until 1973, which was 107 years. African American Main Street and Civil Rights Movement. Pickett Chapel anchored the west end of Market Street, the African American Main Street, throughout much of the 20th century, and was an important part of religious and social life. Pickett Chapel hosted civil rights activists in the 1960s who protested the segregation of public schools and public places in Wilson County. After threat bombing Pickett Chapel, activists relocated next door to Dr. John Glover's office, which was attacked during Lebanon's Bloody Night. The ruins of Dr. Glover's office are preserved and owned by the Wilson County Black History Committee. Community theater. Pickett Chapel was also home of several community theater groups who produced well-known plays like South Pacific, Guys and Dolls, Barefoot in the Park, and many others. The Wilson County Black History Committee purchased Pickett Chapel in 2007 and have worked since to restore and establish a museum dedicated to the history and achievements of African Americans in Wilson County. With the assistance of Wilson County Commission, the mortgage of Pickett Chapel was retired in full through public and private donations. The committee has completed restoration of critical structure components. At this time, I was to have another person that could give more in depth with my presentation. The Reverend Dr. Vincent Harris, I don't know if he's on or not, but I know he had planned to be on. But Pickett Chapel is the place that we want for this community And once we are established, it would become the home of the Roy Bailey African American Museum and History Center with free admission, but donations accepted. Museum programs include lecture series, video, audio presentations, student study groups, community meetings, chapel grounds, activities, and more. Education programs at the museum will connect with the Wilson County school system, history and social studies program. Home of special events, including MLK Unity, March, Black History Month, celebration, Heritage Peace Garden celebration, recognition of civil rights activists, Kwanzaa, and other events. Just to give a few of the milestones of what the Wilson County Black History has done over the years to restore the chapel. Well, in 2007, it was purchased for $63,500. 2010, the east wall collapsed and was stabilized with a grant from the Tennessee Historical Commission, $39,000. 2013, a new roof and cupola restored, $8,000. 2014, structural enforcement installation of drainage system. Just 1 second. And in 2017, restoration of brick arc and front elevation, installation and custom milled front doors, installation of ADA compliant rear door. 2018, the old annex was removed. 2020, rebuilt and dedicated at Juneteenth celebration. At the present, the chapel next phase is to get electrical work done, complete the barrel vaulted ceiling, floors, walls, and the estimate cost at this time is $300,000. This does not include our display units or exhibits. That pretty much ends my presentation. If I had known maybe more of how it should have been with pictures, I would have done so. But as I listened to the ladies from the grant, we have just submitted a grant to you under the Wilson County Black History Committee Pickett Chapel Restoration Project. So it looks really wonderful. The church just warmed my heart that has been restored. So on behalf of the Wilson County Black History Committee and the restoration team, we want to say thank you for letting us just let you know where we are with restoring Black churches. And this church has been a blessing to this community, and we want to see it done. So we're doing the best that we can. And thank you so much.
Mary, another totally fascinating story. What history? I mean, that's amazing that
Yes.
the African-American congregation held services at Pickett Chapel for 107 years.
Yes.
During such a historic time. That's really something. And also, I see in my notes, if I'm correct, that in 1866, the chapel was sold to 30 freedmen for the sum of $1,500.
Yes.
So I think that really gives all of us a very good clue as to how incredibly important these sacred places are, as if we didn't know that, right, Lawana?
True.
So now I would love it if all of our speakers were on camera, which I believe they are. We have a number of questions for you guys because everyone's riveted by the work you're doing. And I'm going to ask Lynn to start posing questions. And we would love to hear from each of our speakers.
Sure. I wanted to find out if Lawana and Leslie had anything more to add. Pamela Foster had asked about historic chapels at HBCUs. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? I know that you answered in the chat.
Yeah, sure. So definitely one of the things I mentioned in the chat is that one of our grantees was a chapel at Lane College. And so we're definitely, interested. We actually have an HBCU, initiative. So we're definitely interested in HBCUs, definitely interested in chapels at HBCUs. And so that's definitely something that we're interested in. And the interesting thing about chapels at HBCUs is the connection between the different denominations that started, HBCUs and the history of that. So there's a great connection between churches and those denominations that started HBCUs and the history of that, and the churches that are still there. And some of those chapels are still active. Some of those churches are now used for something else. And so you have both some that are used, like there's Sisters Chapel at Spelman that is, still used, but then you might have another chapel that is now used for another purpose. And either of those scenarios are fine. And so definitely for any of those, historic churches, historic chapels that are in HBCUs, those are definitely, eligible depending on the age of those chapels to apply for one of our grants. So we're definitely interested in those. And I'm specifically interested, Ms. Foster, in the fact that you are looking at 150 of these. So definitely would love to talk to you about those.
So may I suggest that all the speakers put their emails in the chat if they don't mind, or an email where someone can be reached, because these are target audiences for all of you, people who are just fascinated by this and working in this field. Thank you, Leslie.
So there were some follow-up questions, Nicole, directed at you about the tunnel. The tunnel, of course, is just incredibly fascinating. And so I don't know if you covered this in your talk or want to expound on it. Is the tunnel viewed as an extension of the church? Are there funds available to preserve it?
As of right now, it's not viewed as an extension of the church. That is what we're working on now, so that we can have it exposed so that people can see it. But that is a goal. That's what I was saying, that we're in our pre-phase 1 stage of getting the Virginia Department of Historic Preservation to recognize it as an extension of the church.
All right, thank you. There was a question, or is it a comment in the Q&A from Lemuel Patterson talking about the Washington Street Presbyterian Church in South Carolina. It's for sale by owner for $65,000. Wanted to know, are funds available for purchasing the building? It's a 501c3. Lawana and
That's a very broad question.
Well, and in terms of our funds, we don't do purchases with our funds. So through Preserving Black Churches, you can't use those funds for acquisition of property. And we do get that question. That's a common question.
But Leslie, there are so many different grants and funding opportunities. As I've said many times before, one thing that I hear from the grant making organizations that we all work with is that often money gets left on the table because people just do not know where to look to get grants and funding. So I would just encourage anyone to, to Google widely grants for African-American communities go to organizations like the Library of Congress or the National Endowment for the Humanities, or even send a query to the National Trust, as they are such a leader in this, to see if they could recommend any other options, because this is such an important topic and it's very timely right now.
Thank you. So, Mary, we've put links to your website for Pickett Chapel in the chat, so everybody check out the chat. And there was a question from Pamela. Thank you again, Pamela, for your wonderful questions today. She asked you, Mary, if you work with AAHGS in Nashville. I don't know what that is. I'm hoping you do.
Well, I don't. So say it again so I can make sure I get in touch.
Pamela, do you have any clarification, Pamela? I'm gonna
Maybe the full name would be
AA.
Yeah, Pamela, I'm going to allow you to talk. So can you clarify? Oops. Pamela, are you there?
I think I'm unmuted now. Yes,
Okay.
I am just so fascinated by all of this. It is the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. So I suggest you do, of course, Davidson County is right by Wilson,
Yes.
and it really is for all of Middle Tennessee. And so I suggest you go to aahgsnashville.org.
Okay.
And yeah, the president, I'll give her a heads up too, if you want to write this, or it'll be on the site. But anyway, Tania, Taneya, shucks, I'm drawing a blank on her last name. That's horrible. Tania Kuntz. So see, let me see. Gosh, I want to say Koonce, but it's one of those Kuntz spellings. And again, you'll see it on the AUGS Nashville site. She's the president. She's also on the national board. But yeah, they've got various interests in, you know, churches, cemeteries, all things related to genealogy and history. So that'd be a great source of hands for you.
Thank you very, very much.
And then I think we have a question posed by Mary and her lovely mom who are with us. Lynn, do you want to read it?
Sure. Thank you, Mary. Historic Hobson Village in Suffolk, Virginia is 145 years old, and the cemetery is faced with erosion from a ravine. The entire village, in spite of being recognized as historical African-American waterman village by the state and national, is not locally being recognized. We have been identified as an environmental justice and gentrification community. Can anybody speak on to that topic? Lawana, please.
Lawana?
I can. I'm actually on the team for the Chesapeake Mapping Initiative, which is looking at the history of African-American watermen around the Chesapeake watershed in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. So part of that project actually is to identify places in Virginia specific to Black Chesapeake watermen. So my hope is that as part of that, we can help to bring visibility to Waterman Village and the cemetery and other historic resources that are related to it. So, but the other thing is that is not unusual in terms of cemeteries being affected by things like erosion and climate change, particularly in a lot of our historic African-American communities where the placement was not ideal to begin with, where communities were started in places that were not the most ideal parts of town or parts of land. So you'll have cemeteries that are being affected by erosion. You have cemeteries, for instance, Olivewood Cemetery in Houston, has the same problem in terms of not only is it affected by flooding, but it's also affected by runoff from a nearby development. So you're having these type of issues cropping up in historic African-American cemeteries and communities across the country.
And if I can also add, this conversation about, especially, well, not especially only about, but often comes up, and I know you guys will agree with me when it comes to talking about African-American burial grounds and cemeteries, which are being destroyed over time, which are being, in some cases, raised and are not getting the attention that they should. But I'm curious specifically to the gentleman that just posed this question, but really I would like to recommend that, one of the things that can really help is your local community, because preservation is local. So advertise on volunteermatch.com or org for volunteers to come in and work with someone who might be a preservationist, who should be a preservationist, to talk about the basic things that could be done to protect cemeteries. I mean, I know that the National Trust and others would love to be able to work on every single one of these projects, but a lot of this is local work. So, and actually burial grounds and cemeteries is an important thing right now. As I've said many times before, Senator Sherrod Brown is working on passing a bill to protect them at the federal level. So continue to read, continue to look and explore, and count on your local community for help.
And especially as cemeteries are so connected to churches. And so many of our churches have these resting places of our ancestors that are important. And as Leslie was saying earlier, sometimes they're the last remnants of Black communities that are no longer there.
And Ghana, I see your point, and you are absolutely right. And I think, so here's we look for groups like the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Hope Crew, hands-on preservation experience, and other national and local preservation groups or student groups that might be able to come in and advise. And then this gets into the whole question of why doesn't historic preservation have more money, which is something we're all working on, right? So I think we're just about at time. Does anyone have another question they'd like to pose, or are we?
Yes, we actually have a really wonderful question that is, I think, will really cap things off. I know that a lot of historic churches, Black churches, are linked to the civil rights movement, and we have a question regarding, have any of you heard about civil rights activists who did the same thing in churches you have preserved? So how closely linked are historic Black churches to the civil rights movement, and what is the importance of, in that regard, don't these places tell a wider story than places of worship in their communities and the nation as a whole?
They've been integral from the beginning, whether it was anti-slavery, abolitionist movement, all the way to now. The African-American church has been such a pillar and central to our community. So I would have to say that they have been absolutely integral to civil rights movement and social movements in the United States.
I would say that, I mean, there's some on our grantee list. There are definitely churches that are directly tied to either the civil rights movement, the anti-slavery movement, or the sort of freedmen, in terms of those formerly enslaved, sort of bringing themselves out of slavery. But then we have those churches that say, well, we weren't directly tied to the civil rights movement, but they are completely active in their communities now in terms of providing direct services to their communities, like social services, in terms of, you know, dealing with homelessness, dealing with mental illness, dealing with all sorts of stuff. So whether it's, you know, civil rights or social issues today or yesterday, you know, churches and communities are being completely impactful, both in our past and both now. So places of worship, but true anchors in Black communities. And one of the things, we did a site visit recently in Los Angeles, and one of the things that I thought was really beautiful is there's a Black church that used to be a Black neighborhood and now is not a Black neighborhood, now is largely Hispanic. And they are now partnering with that population, in which Black people still worship there, but on other days, the Hispanic population worships there and has teaches Spanish and English there, has a daycare there, and they really have this, you know, beautiful relationship there. And it's a really great model for how this church that is of this former Black community, that's still now a Black church in a neighborhood that is now has a different population, has managed to build this really beautiful relationship in which they're still serving the community that's there. So it still continues to be of service to its own community and now another community.
Yes. Well, as I stated, I was in the midst of that. Pickett Chapel was the only Black church that welcomed the activists, and a lot of the training was done at Pickett Chapel. And then, as I spoke about, the doctor's office was right next to that. And on our historic marker, on one side we have the history of Pickett Chapel, on the other side we have about the civil rights movement at Pickett Chapel. So it's a great thing.
You guys are all doing incredible work. And just before I turn to the thank yous, I want to add one more thing for people working out there that don't know where to turn. There are many colleges and universities across the country that have preservation certificates or degrees or minors, and those departments, those areas of study, those academic programs that are available to each of you in your states might be very interested in helping out with a local project, such as working on a cemetery. Plus, they have, you know, the knowledge and the skills to be able to impart to your community. Don't hesitate to reach out and see what school in your state has a preservation academic program, because they can be very helpful. And I just want to say it's such a pleasure to see all of, I know I shouldn't say but all of our HBCU students here. This webinar series is in conjunction with the work the ACHP does with the White House Initiative on HBCUs. I love working with all of you. I know we all do, and I'm so happy to see you all here today. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists and our participants. The presentations were marvelous. As usual, the conversation is great. It has truly been a sincere pleasure to host this webinar. So please take a moment to fill out the survey that will pop up as you exit the webinar, because we use that information to decide what we will do again next year. And don't forget to follow us on our social media. Lastly, I just want to say thank you again to our panelists. You guys were wonderful today.
Thank you for
everyone. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
You also, all of you. Thank you.